anything to dig out from under. Anyway, I've seen a lot of information about weapon transfers from various NATO countries, plus the Swedes and the Finns, to the Ukrainians. Nothing's new there. But what was new was the scale and the technological level. Now, of course, in the case of the United States, this is taking the form of more advanced types of artillery, but it really runs the gamut, and it really is different based on which country you're talking about. So, for example, Slovakia has apparently given their entire air force to the Ukrainians, and they're relying upon their NATO allies in order to patrol their own skies to keep their own defense agreements. Now, this is kind of a defense kickline that we have seen in NATO a couple of times before. Whenever there's a significant change in the geopolitical environment, like there is now, or say when the Cold War ended, weapons move around. So the last time this happened at scale, it was 1992 to 2000. The Soviet system had collapsed. The new European countries were negotiating to accede to NATO, but there was still a lot going on. We saw the Germans and the French and the Italians go through a degree of disarmament because the Cold War was over, and they had treaty limits for how much weapons they could have, so they'd get under that level now that the war was over. They transferred a lot of those weapons to Turkey, which was well under its threshold. So we had some minor upgrading in Western Europe, and then this hand-me-down process going to Turkey, and the alliance got stronger as a result. We're seeing some version of that now with Ukraine. So in the case of the Slovak example, they've transferred their entire air force over. They're buying American and German-made aircraft to replace that. So they're going to get an upgrade, and the older stuff goes on to Ukraine. Some version of this is happening with anti-aircraft radar and with javelins and with tanks and with artillery. Everyone in the West is moving their older stuff east and then buying new stuff for what they anticipate will be a prolonged period of hostility. Everyone wins, of course, except for the Russians, who have the ammo like thrown into the teeth of their war machine. But the best part of all of this, of course, is that for the Ukrainians, these are weapon systems they already know how to use. This is exactly the same stuff that they had. See, when the Soviet system collapsed, all the Soviet military stuff was everywhere. And in the case of the Central Europeans, and to a lesser degree the Ukrainians, they didn't have the money to upgrade to what are now NATO standards. So NATO changed their standards. And they said that as long as you do some security upgrades so things can't be hacked, and to make it so Russian intelligence won't have a kind of a purchase, will allow you to keep your gear until your economy expands to the point that you can do an overhaul. Well, that overhaul is now happening, and the old stuff is being put to use. Okay, that's it from me for today. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and I will see you Monday.
It's not a done deal, so I don't want to overplay this, but if it does happen, it means a few things have changed. Now, the weapon systems that the Western world and the US in particular have been giving to the Ukrainians always have to meet one of three total criteria. First, it has to be a weapon system that we don't really need. And so if you look at everything that we have sent to this point, almost all of it, except for maybe some ammo, falls into the category of something that the United States does not use with its regular forces. In fact, most of this stuff started their production runs long before the 1990s and has been sitting in a warehouse throughout the entirety of the War on Terror. So there's mostly stuff that was slated for destruction. So when you see numbers like 40 billion in terms of the amount of aid that the Americans have given, keep in mind that it would probably cost us more than that to dispose of the equipment. So if anything, the Ukrainians are doing us a favor here. Second, it has to be technology that is old enough that if it fell into Russian hands, it would not give them or any of their potential friends or allies around the world a leg up in anything. So again, we're talking about things that were developed during the 70s and the 80s and haven't really seen battlefield use for a while. That's one of the reasons why the Air Force has been unable to send its older Predator drones, because even though they're 15, 20 years old, they still have technologies that we really don't want the rest of the world to get a peek at. The third big thing, it has to be something that the Ukrainians can operate themselves. The decision was made very early in the war to avoid escalation, to make sure that there were not American forces or NATO forces that could be in a position where they would directly confront Russian forces. And the reason is pretty simple. If you have Western forces in Ukraine, you will then have to have Western air cover and Western ground cover. And in that sort of situation, a direct head-to-head fight with the Russians would obliterate the Russian positions completely. We discovered that that would happen because of the Battle of Kiev and how bad the Russians actually did in real combat. And in that sort of scenario, the Russians would have little choice but to escalate up to and including nukes. So this has kept most of our top tier technologies off the table completely, these three conditions. That might not any longer apply to the Patriots. Now, on the surface, putting a Patriot in a position to shoot down, say, Iranian drones seems kind of silly. It's $4 million a shot. The Patriots were designed for nearly theater-level air defense, designed to shoot down nuclear weapons, for example, things where it really, really matters. And say sending them after a $15,000, $20,000 Shahed drone seems kind of silly. But a few things are different now. First of all, this is an air defense system, so it would never be on the front line. It would be designed to protect certain sites and cities across the Ukrainian space, which means the chances of the technology falling into Russian hands are negligible. They would have to have a pretty severe breakthrough in the front lines for that to even be a risk, and they are all mobile, so you could just drive it away if it looked like the city was going to fall. Second, there's a prestige issue here, not for the Americans, for the Russians. Because if they found out there was a Patriot defending a site, they would saturate that site with absolutely everything they could to prove that Patriots don't work, or even better, to potentially destroy one of them. That is something that is actually a feature, not a bug. Because if you've got the Russians going after a specific weapon system, then they're not shooting at cities. So you put it in some place that is not all that critical, and you use it as a sponge to just soak up Russian ammo so that, say, power plants don't get taken offline. But the third reason is probably the most politically and strategically significant one. From the Western point of view, the reason we don't put Western people on the ground is to avoid escalation. But from the Western point of view, that escalation has already occurred. Over the last few weeks, the Russians have been deliberately and extensively targeting civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, knocking out power and water in cities that have over 1 million people in the middle of winter, which is causing mass casualties and fatalities throughout the entire civilian population. Now, this is the specific goal of the Russian assaults, but this accounts to multiple war crimes on a daily basis, conscious war crimes, not incidental, not accidental, deliberate. And in that changed political math, all of a sudden, the feeling is that, we're already seeing a degree of escalation already. So if it takes a few American troops to operate a weapon system, a defensive weapon system, that the Ukrainians can't learn right away, then maybe it's worth it. This is not something we can just hand over. Americans train on their newer equipment, not for weeks or months, but for years. And there's no way we can just hand this over to the Ukrainians and expect it to be operated. We will have to have advisors on the ground, several dozen per battery. But the math has changed. And I think the thing that really tipped the Americans over to seriously consider this was the discovery of torture chambers for children in Kherson, something that serves no purpose whatsoever except for to specifically and deliberately further a genocide. And that apparently is a line that the Russians have crossed that really matters to the Western countries. And so the Patriot could very well be in play very soon. All right.
The Ukrainians are likely to fall. Today, I think it's worth underlining that even if the Ukrainians are wildly successful, or horribly unsuccessful, we are really only at the beginning of a very long, drawn-out military conflict here. Because for the Russians, they see this conflict as existential and only as step one. The problem is that Russian territory is really poor, and it's flat, and it's open, and it can't support a very high population density. So the only strategy that the Russians have ever discovered in the last 400 years that allows them a degree of security is for them to expand out beyond the territories they hold, absorb ethnic group after ethnic group, of which the Ukrainians are only one of many, and eventually expand until they reach a series of geographic barriers that are not flat and open. And in the case of Ukraine, that means the Caucasus Mountains and the Carpathians and the Baltic Sea, which means that Ukraine is not the end here. The Russians are going to go until they reach a geographical crustal defense that they can man with their rapidly declining demographic structure. And that means even if the Ukrainians fall to a man, even if they're wiped out completely, the Russians are not done. They will then come for Romania and Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and probably Finland as well. So the Russians' minimum victory isn't the territories they hold now. It's not holding on to Crimea. It isn't Kiev. It isn't Lvov. It's Warsaw. And that's a different sort of conflict than people have been preparing for at this point. But for the Russians, that is the minimum that will give them what they need, physical security. Now, what about the Ukrainians? Now, the Ukrainians say they're going to liberate every inch of territory, which includes the entirety of Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Crimea. Only that doesn't make them any more secure. It gives them a little bit better strategic depth. It gives them some of their industrial heartland and some of their coal and steel industry back. But at the end of the day, that doesn't stop the Russians, because for the Russians, this is a battle for their existential survival. And even if they are ejected from Ukraine, they will not stop. They will rearm, they will rest, they will recruit, and they will make it another attempt. So, if the Ukrainians are to prevent the Russians from actually waging war, if they're going to stop this from happening again, after they get the Donbass and Crimea, they then need to cross into Russia proper. And they need to neutralize two specific urban areas that serve as logistical hubs. The first is Belgorod, which is just north of Kharkiv, which serves as the primary artery for transporting material, men, and fuel into the northern aspects of the front. If Belgorod could be neutralized, if the rail and the roads could be taken out, if the industrial infrastructure could be destroyed, if the fuel centers could be removed, then the Russians would have to proceed on foot on that front, and that is not a feasible option in an industrial war. The second one is much more complicated. It's further to the southeast. It's called Rostov-on-Don. It's a port city on the Don River, and it serves as the only logistical hub for supplying the entirety of the southern front. Not only can you get into Donetsk and Luhansk from there, that's the only way you can get into the Crimea. It's the other side of the bridge, if you will. Now, if the Ukrainians were to take the war to this point, there would be more going on here than simply preventing the Russians from launching another assault. It would also be about crippling Russia's ability to maintain its own territorial coherence. Rostov-on-Don also serves as the primary logistical point to connect the greater Moscow region, where most Russians live, south through road and rail to Rostov-on-Don, and then further south to the Caucasus, which is one of those all-important barrier points that the Russians feel they must control. And for those of you who have been asleep for the last 30 years, there's an ethnic group there called the Chechens at the very end of that chain. Well, Chechnya and Dagestan. If the Ukrainians were to succeed in neutralizing Rostov-on-Don, you can bet your ass that the Chechens are going to launch a third rebellion. And this time, the Russians wouldn't be able to easily reinforce or assault the Chechens, meaning that this time it would probably be successful, especially when you consider that the Ukrainians have already soaked up a lot of the military equipment and ammo that the Russians had stockpiled since 1945. So what we're looking at here, one way or another, is an extreme breakdown of the security order. Either the Russians win, which means Ukraine ceases to exist and we're in a direct nuclear confrontation between NATO and Russia, or the Ukrainians win and neutralize Russia's ability to control large chunks of its own territory, likely heralding the disintegration of the Russian state itself, which also has nuclear connotations. So a lot of countries in the West have, in my opinion, been doing the right thing in the right order and almost even at the right speed in order to fight the Russians back. But I don't think a lot of brain power has been dedicated to what happens the next day if one side actually wins this round. Now, luckily, even in the most outsized Ukrainian success this year, this is not a problem for 2023.
Martin Research Facility down there below me looks really cool after sunset. It's lit up. It looks like a spaceship setting down in the rocks. Anyway, this is part 2 of our ongoing series on the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive. Expect to see that starting probably either in the last week of May or sometime in June, once the ground has firmed up enough that it's not muddy and tanks can actually maneuver. We've already seen the Ukrainians do a significant amount of prep in terms of preliminary attacks to hobble the Russians' ability to move. Now, for those of you who've been following me for a while, you know that the Russian system, the military, is designed to fight by rail. It does not do well with truck. They don't have very many, and they've lost most of what they have. They prefer to put their troops and their equipment on rail lines, rail them as close as possible, and then throw everything like a giant fist at their foes. That has been a problem in this conflict so far because the Ukrainians managed to take out the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was the only reliable rail connection into the Crimea. And they've gone after a number of rail connections and nodes in the eastern sections of Ukraine, an area known as the Donbass, which takes up the two provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. And that has made it more difficult for the Russians as well, though not nearly as bad as Crimea. What they've been doing of late, what the Ukrainians have been doing of late, is using a mix of missiles, drones, and other aircraft to target fuel depots and fuel trains. And they've hit some very close to the border of Belarus in the north. They've hit some near Rostov-on-Don, some near Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, and then of course in Crimea itself. Because trucks use a lot more fuel to move the same amount of cargo compared to trains. So if the Ukrainians can hobble the Russians' ability to move about the battlefield, then the Ukrainians can use superior movement. And this has always been a war of movement for the Ukrainians. The Russians are slow but powerful. So Ukrainian strategies has been to move quick, punch through the lines, get behind them, partially encircle the Russians, and then force a rout where the Russians just leave everything behind. And that's what they did in Kharkiv province in their summer offensive and in their fall offensive in Kherson. The hope that the Ukrainians have is they're going to be able to do that again with their spring offensive. And it really breaks down into two major pieces. The first is going to be a series of eastward thrusts into the Donbass to hit those other rail connections to break up Russian formations in the Donbass so they can't maneuver to assist one another, allowing the Ukrainians to dice them up and take their stuff. You know, reasonable strategy. It's worked a couple times already. But the bigger push is going to be going on the east side of the Dnieper River and then punching straight south through the province of Zaporizhzhia in order to get to the Sea of Azov, which is an inlet off of the Black Sea. And if they can do that, they not only cut whatever remaining light rail connections that might be partially available to the Russians for logistics right now, they also cut every single land connection and basically take the entirety of the southwestern part of the front and all of the Crimean Peninsula and put it in a box. Because once the Ukrainians can get to the Sea of Azov, they'll be able to take out the rest of the Kerch Bridge, and then not even military trucks will be able to get into resupply. And then you'll have the best forces that the Russians have completely trapped, completely devoid of reinforcements. The Navy will have to withdraw because the Ukrainians can then hit any of the Crimean ports with missiles that they have. And the beautiful thing from the Ukrainian point of view is these attacks that they've already used to cross into Russia proper, that uses Ukrainian gear. American gear at the moment is not allowed to be used on Russian territory. So with every inch that the Ukrainians close towards the border, more and more of their own stuff can do deep strike into Russia proper. Now, if some of this, the Donbass campaign, the Zaporizhzhia campaign, sounds a little bit familiar, that's because I mentioned this before. I thought there was going to be a winter counterattack, and so back in November, I basically released a video more or less lining up about half of what I just did right now. Which brings me to why you shouldn't take what I'm taking too seriously. Number one, weather wins. And if we get a wet May, then this attack is going to be pushed back, not just to June, but maybe into July and even in August, and there might not be enough time to do it at scale anyway. Second, the Ukrainians have proven themselves very adept at fooling people into thinking what their actual intentions are. So for example, the Kharkiv offensive last year, which was the biggest victory for the Ukrainians of the war so far, they didn't advertise that at all. They made everybody think they were going after Kherson first, and that attack did happen, but it was really just designed to draw Russian troops away from where the Ukrainians really wanted to go, and in the end they ended up getting them both. So obviously the Russians get a vote in this. Obviously the Ukrainians are going to decide where they go. What I'm outlining are the logical steps and things that ultimately Ukraine is going to have to do if it's going to win this war, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it on my time frame. All right. There are a lot of reasons to expect a lot of action, and we're going to have to break this up into chunks. Today, we're going to talk about the stuff that we know is inevitable. We've seen significant improvements in Ukrainian air defense to the point that over 90% of the missiles and drones that the Russians have been firing in have not been able to hit their targets, which is, great if you are in Ukraine because they've been targeting the power grid. However, once it becomes apparent that the Ukrainians are going to move, and once it becomes apparent that the weather is warm enough that targeting the power sector isn't going to kill any civilians, Russians in Ukraine, the Russians are going to switch their targets to facilities that are more difficult to defend, and that is the agricultural supply chain system. So on the 18th, there is a deal that lapses. The Turks and the United Nations have brokered a deal between Ukraine and Russia that allows civilian bulk trade shipping vessels to get into Ukrainian ports after being searched by the Russians, load up with Ukrainian corn, wheat, sunflower, and other stuff, and they get re-inspected on their way out just to make sure that they're not smuggling anything in, such as, say, weapons. The Russians have been warning for weeks, if not months, that they're backing away from the deal, and they're definitely not going to be renewing it next week when it becomes up for renewal, because they need to switch target sets. In the past, they've gone for the power grid because that's how you kill people in Ukraine in the winter, but once you get to summer, you have to starve them. And this is probably going to be the end of meaningful agricultural exports from Ukraine. They're going to go for ships, they're going to go for ports, they're going to go for loading facilities, they're going to go for cold chain systems, they're going to go for silos and storage facilities, and of course any place that builds or maintains agricultural equipment. This stuff is a lot more dispersed, it's a lot harder to defend. It's not like just putting a bunch of air defense around a city, and you're going to have a lot more target hits because of it. But that's how this is going to go. On the Ukrainian side, this doesn't mean that you should expect an assault before the 18th. In fact, I really don't think it's going to happen this month. And the problem is simply weather, and not like abnormal weather, just how it normally is. The problem the Ukrainians face is that every fall and every spring, the country just gets deluged, and the land is very flat and it doesn't drain very well. So you get mud. Not mud that's like 3 or 4 inches deep, but mud that can be 6 to 8 feet deep. And until it dries out, you simply cannot move people, much less tanks, unless they're on a road. If you have heavy equipment on a road, you're just asking for it to get blown up. So, while the Ukrainians appear to be nearly ready, they've brought in a lot of weaponry, all the battle tanks that NATO has promised are there, and they've even trained up on a few jets that have been donated. They can't move yet, and so it's probably going to be the last week of May or into June when things finally dry out. That's just kind of traditionally when the spring mud season ends. So it's coming, it's close, but we're not here yet. Now, in tomorrow's session, we're going to talk about what the goals are of the Ukrainian offensive, but I'm going to warn you right now, the Ukrainians have done well because they've been unpredictable. And after that, we'll start talking about minimum
as well, white and trees. Anyway, yesterday we talked a little bit about how the Japanese have realized that they're never going to be a singular great power again, and so have found a way to partner up with the country that is most likely to either encourage them or dislodge them, and that's the United States. And today we're going to talk about Turkey in kind of the same context. Now, unlike the Japanese, who have admitted that they will never be the dominant naval power in the Pacific and never the economic power of the Pacific again, the Turks are nowhere near that stage, and with good reason. Their geography is different, their economic structure is different, their demographics are different. Demographically, they are the youngest of the G20 countries, with the exception of Argentina. And they've got the highest birth rate, again, aside from Argentina, which gives them a lot of opportunities moving forward, meaning that if current aging and urbanization trends continue, they're not going to face a German-style situation within the next 50 years. So, they got that most valuable of commodities, time. Second, they're on a peninsula, so it is relatively difficult to attack the Turkish space by land. And to make sure that no one tries, Turkey today maintains the second largest army in NATO. So, unlike the Japanese, who were overwhelmed back in the 40s by American naval power, there's really no one even on the horizon who could potentially challenge the Turks at home. As to their neighborhood, Turkish interests are a lot more varied, and they're a lot more questionable calls. The Japanese, they're a series of islands with very few resources, so they have to go out, and there's certain things that they have to achieve in terms of security and economic control, or at least influence in the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan and the Chinese mainland and Southeast Asia and all the sea lanes going across the Pacific. They really have to have it all if they're going to succeed. And they know they can only get that all hand in glove with the United States. Well, the Turkish situation requires a lot more thought, not because there's a right answer, but because there's many potential opportunities. They have interests in the Caucasus with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. They have interests in northern Iraq and the Levant, which involves the Israelis, the Eastern Mediterranean, which of course involves the Egyptians, the Aegean Sea with the Greeks, and most importantly, in my opinion, in the Eastern Balkans with Bulgaria and Romania. And that's where today's conversation kind of takes us. There are plenty of hot takes out there, including for myself, on how this war may or may not roll out. We're talking about Ukraine now. But if the Russians are successful, and honestly, still by the numbers, this is still Russia's war to lose, Ukraine will in time fall. And the place that the Russians are most likely to turn to next is a zone of territory called the Bessarabian Gap, which makes up what is today's Moldova and a northeastern slice of Romania, roughly 20% of Romania's territory. Because the Russians see the Bessarabian Gap as one of the primary invasion zones that access the Russian interior. And they want to concentrate a military footprint in that zone to make sure that no one can try. Well, the Turks see it basically the same way, just from the other side. A number of assaults that have aimed for Istanbul over the millennia have gone through that same gap. Now, right now, the Turks kind of have the best of both worlds. It's NATO territory, and so it has a NATO security guarantee, especially the Romanian chunk, but the Turks don't have to plug it themselves, so they're a big beneficiary almost incidentally from the current security order. But if the Russians were to take that, then the Turkish heartland, the Turkish capital, the Turkish Straits, would all be directly vulnerable to Russian power, and the Turks cannot tolerate that. So the primary reason that the Turks are still remaining engaged in the NATO alliance, at least for the moment, is because of that promise of a security bloc in that zone. And if for whatever reason the Americans back away from Ukraine, the Turks would have no choice but to step in directly and partner with Romania and forward position military forces in the gap to make sure that that the Russians can't try anything cute. But on the broader issue of power, Turkey is just in a better position than the Japanese are. We've already talked about demographics. In terms of geography, it's not like they're kind of dangling at the end of Asia, so they need a globe-spanning navy to access raw materials and resources markets. They're at the crossroads of Europe and Africa and Asia. So as long as there is trade, whether it is by water or by land, the Turks have some cards to play. In addition, whereas the Japanese have bit by bit de-industrialized and moved into services and high tech over the last 30 years, the Turks have been rapidly industrializing, in part to serve as a kind of a supply depot and a middle manufacturing zone for the Europeans, much in the way that Mexico does with the United States. And in terms of value add, if you compare the cost of the stuff that goes in versus the cost of the stuff that comes out, Turkey is one of the most high value-added economies in the world already. Turkey is broadly self-sufficient in all the foodstuffs that it produces for itself. It never kind of got into this craze that a lot of countries have, that they have to have organic avocados that are out of season. So even if global trade shut down tomorrow, their trade system would be broadly okay. And for energy, they may be a significant importer of everything but coal, but the places that they have the options of importing from are many. Today, they're getting a lot of their natural gas and oil from Russia, but tomorrow it could very easily be northern Iraq or Azerbaijan. In fact, several of those pipelines are already in place, and it's only been some political squabbling that has kept them from running at full capacity. So, nothing like a blackout to motivate. And so what we're seeing in terms of how the Turks versus the Japanese are dealing with the Ukraine war, the Japanese have signed on to the American-led system, and so they are going in up to their armpits with helping out the Ukrainians, however is appropriate for their own cultural milieu. The Turks have been a lot more circumspect. They definitely don't want the Russians to win. But they see the advantage of not having this blow up and have the Russians just disappear altogether, especially if you think like I do that ultimately this is Russia's war to win. Now, to that end, the Turks have been very active in not so much bypassing the sanctions that are on Russia, but providing the Russians with ways to get around them. So there are a lot of things that are under secondary sanction restriction, like semiconductors, that the Turks have been importing 4 or 5 times as much as they normally do, and then they're just selling them on to the Russians. There's a very strong mercantile culture in Turkey. If you're familiar with Star Trek, this is basically a nation of Ferengi when it comes to trade. There's also been a number of banks within the Turkish space that have helped the Russians access the dollar and the euro market, because the Russians discovered early on in the conflict that yuan aren't worth the paper that they were printed on. Basically, if you buy yuan assets, you're stuck with yuan because the Chinese don't want it back. They find their own currency borderline useless. So that little mistake cost the Russians a few $100 billion. Anyway, what's changed in the last couple of weeks is that two things. Number one, trail runners. Wow. How did they do that? Two things have changed. First of all, pressure from Europe and the United States on the Turks to push stricter compliance with the secondary sanctions regime has been fairly successful. And the Turkish government is now shutting down a lot of these middlemen that allow banned goods into the Russian space. We've already seen semiconductors from things like washing machines end up in Russian cruise missiles. So it's clear that the Russians have been working to establish an alternate supply system, and anything that chokes that off is going to force them to start over. Second, the banking issue. The federal government in the United States has specifically warned the Turks that if they don't cut that out, that they risk falling under the sanctions themselves. And that didn't require a lot of prodding from the Turkish government. The Turkish banks were like, okay, message sent, you're serious about this. And they kind of shut down that window as it was. The bottom line here is that the Turks have a little bit more wiggle room, despite the fact that they are more exposed to the security issues that are going in Ukraine. And because they see themselves in the long runs as having options to great powerhood, which is an accurate assessment, they don't want to just follow blindly in the way that the Japanese are willing to. This is a country that in the long term is unlikely to be part of the American alliance network because it's going to lead its own. And who all gets involved in that will in many ways be dependent upon how the war in Ukraine proceeds from this point forward. Because if the Russians do prove to be successful, well then Bulgaria and Romania are going to be the first countries to sign up willingly for a Turkish-centric defense system. All right.
People are awful at naming things. No big transition here. We're just going to talk about nuclear war and the Ukraine conflict. I've always been of the belief that nukes were not likely to be used in this conflict, despite the rhetoric that has been coming out of the Kremlin ever since the war started back in February. Nukes don't achieve what the Russians want. Now, the Russian goal here is to capture all of Ukraine and then push through it in order to secure the access points to the Russian space, specifically the ones in Romania and Poland. So using tactical nukes on the battlefield in Ukraine doesn't help because they then have to occupy that space, and that gets messy, and your soldiers get messy very, very quickly. Also, a strategic strike on the United States wouldn't help because, well, there's a lot of things we don't know about the Russian military, but we know its quality is lower than the American one, and that probably includes the nuclear arsenal. So even a single or limited strike on the United States would generate the end of the Russian system, and specifically the end of the entire Russian elite, Moscow, and personally Vladimir Putin. So that's never really been on the table either. That just leaves the question of using strategic nukes, city flatteners, in order to prevent Europeans from assisting the Ukrainians in the defense of their own country. And in that, that's always where the risk has been, in my opinion. So the Russians would go after the countries who, if they switched sides, either because they fell apart or because they were intimidated after losing a couple of cities, that would change the strategic balance in terms of weapon flows. And so that would be in order: Berlin, Warsaw, Stockholm, Paris, and then London. Now, in the days before September 1st, that is generally my position, that if the Russians feel that they have to nuke someone, those are the 5 cities they would go after, because it would disrupt the weapon flows going into Ukraine. However, in the aftermath of the Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians have captured sufficient equipment and tanks and artillery to equip 15,000 people in an entire armored division. That's a bigger weapon transfer to the Ukrainians than everything that NATO has done to this point. And in the Kherson offensive, which is still ongoing, they're likely to get even more gear. So weapon flows all of a sudden are not the important thing that they used to be. It's not that they're unimportant, but the Ukrainians are going to be able to put 30,000 additional troops into the field here with the best equipment that the Russians have. And unlike the Western gear where the Ukrainians need training, they already know how to use all the Russian gear. So we are at a tipping point, and that raises the question of whether nukes are of any use to the Russians whatsoever. That just leaves one possible scenario. that the Russians realize they're going to lose, that Putin realizes that he's done, that he realizes he's going to be a villain to history, not just Western history, Russian history, and he just decides to go out with a bang. While we can never rule that out, I find it unlikely. When the Soviet system collapsed, the then KGB basically had a meeting where they discussed whether they should just release the nukes onto the world, not in terms of launch, but sharing, so that the United States would then have to spend the next century dealing with it. They ultimately decided that even though they had lost, and that was sad for them, that they didn't want to be the end of the human condition, and so they kept the nukes bottled up as best they could. Putin was part of the organization that made that decision. So I find it unlikely at this point that he would go a different direction. The risk, and something that I'm sure the folks at the Defense Department are now stressing about a little bit, is we have seen how poorly maintained every aspect of the Russian military is. And it's an open question whether the Russian nuclear arsenal works. So in the worst case scenario, what happens if Putin hits the big red button, and we know it because we've been reading his email and listening to his phone calls, and nothing happens? What do you do when someone tries to kill 10?
There's a strategic reason for that, but I wanted to talk about the economic sacrifice that the Germans are making right now. Now, unlike the United States, which is relatively agnostic about where we get our industrial inputs, the Germans have to have a plan because they don't have any of it local. So what they do is they cut deals with the Russians to bring natural gas in at large volumes and reasonable prices. That provides not just the basis for their entire electricity sector, but also their entire manufacturing sector, because that natural gas is processed into petrochemical goods, which are then the basis of manufacturing. So if something happens to the natural gas flows, the entire German manufacturing model fails. Now, back on September 1, the Russians cut off supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline. Excuse me, getting over laryngitis. And told the Germans publicly that until you cease participating in the NATO coalition supporting Ukraine, and until you lift all sanctions, we're not turning this back on. This was 40% of their supply. And that meant that the Germans had to replace that 40% with marginal suppliers, and so natural gas prices in Germany have gone through the roof to the point that it's no longer economically viable to generate electricity or the petrochemicals that undergird the entire economic model. The Russians basically told the Germans, you can be modern and industrialized and neutral, or you can choose to be Western and lose everything. And the Germans went with option B. And now that Nord Stream has been blown up, there's no going back, even if we had a government shift in Germany and Russia today. So we are looking at nothing less than the complete collapse of the German manufacturing model in just the next year or two. So, could the Germans have done more with weapons? Maybe. But the sacrifice that they've chosen to make is higher than what anyone else who is supporting Ukraine has done. Now, with the bombings that we had a couple of days ago in Kiev, the German consulate got hit by one of those missiles. And the Germans sat up, noticed that real quick, and have already delivered air defense systems to the Ukrainians. So now that the damage is done economically and they know exactly what's in front of them and what's at stake, I think we're going to see a lot more of this moving forward. So Germany may very soon be not just the country that is sacrificing the most, but one of the countries that is also donating the most. Okay.
Where is the first day in a month that it's actually going to be below freezing in Kiev during the day. It's going to be chilly for the next few days, but not enough to freeze the ground. And then back by the time we're into mid next week, it will be above freezing again. So it is still muddy. As long as it's muddy, the Ukrainians cannot maneuver, especially with tanks out in the fields. And that's a real problem. Any conflict with the Russians was always going to be heavy on numbers, and the Ukrainians simply don't have the population in order to face down the Russians man for man. So they need to inflict massively out of whack casualty ratios on the folks that they're fighting. And I'm not talking 2 to 3 to 1 like we've seen so far, like 8 to 10 to 1 is really kind of the minimum if they are going to walk away from this. The Russians see this war as a battle for their existential survival. They're right, they're not going to stop. And so the only way for Ukraine to emerge victorious is to kill so many Russian soldiers so quickly that the Russian front collapses and the military system within the Russian Federation requires years to recover. We are nowhere close to that. And the only way that the Ukrainians could pull that off is if they can outmaneuver the Russians, and that requires fields that are not mud.
This has allowed the Russians to play to their strengths and just throw body after body after body into a few battles, most notably the Battle of Bakhmut, which until now, the main effort has been led by the Wagner Group for internal political reasons, but honestly, the internal political reasons don't matter. As long as the Ukrainians can't maneuver and as long as the Russians have superior numbers, it's just an issue of throwing wave after wave of humans at them until the weather changes to a degree or the logistics shifts to a degree that the battles can move elsewhere. That's unlikely to happen until May. Now, Wagner has been using almost exclusively convicts in their human wave tactics, and as to the number of people that have been lost, the estimates are in the process of being revised by everyone, because everyone is always changing these sort of things during a war. They're starting to use more radio intercepts to guess how many Russians have been killed. The problem is if you go with just visual confirmation, you're going to wildly undercount, because it doesn't count people who were injured, who then were taken away from the front and then died, because the Russians' triage system and medical system is beyond atrocious. And so probably for every person that is visually killed, there's another half to a person that then wandered away and died. Anyway, we now know that the minimum deaths in the war so far on the Russian side is 120,000, and the estimates for Russian deaths in the Battle of Bakhmut specifically are somewhere between 10 and 40,000, just for one little strategically insignificant town. Anyway, for the next couple of months, this is just where we are. It's probably too late in the season at this point to hope for a really hard freeze, so we're going to have to wait for things to dry out in May before the Ukrainians might be able to move. By the time we get to May, the Russians will have really moved a lot more troops into the front. They started the war with somewhere between 100 and 150,000. Today, they probably have about 250,000. And with the second mobilization already deep underway, we're probably going to be around 600,000 to 700,000 by the time we get to May and June. Now, they will be badly led, and they will be badly equipped, and they will be badly supplied, and they will have poor morale, and they'll be badly trained. And you know what you call troops like that? Russian. There is nothing about the conflict to this point that is atypical in Russian history. They rarely win on quality. They almost always win on numbers. And we're almost to the point where we're going to see just how well these new infusions of NATO equipment help the Ukrainians on the front line, and just how many massive waves and assaults the Russians can sustain at the same time. And this is going to put the battle in a bit of a pickle for the Ukrainians, because they're going to be facing 2-3 major assaults from the Russians at different points of contact. And if they allow themselves to get bogged down deflecting each and every one of those, they're going to lose. They need to free this up into a war of movement and allow their tanks and their artillery and their rockets to do an offensive in a place where the Russians either can't resist or can't maneuver to counter them. So by the time we get to May, we are going to be in a very fluid strategic environment, most likely with the Ukrainians just kind of backing off, putting the minimum forces they can in this or that front just to slow the Russians down, while they try to do lightning strikes and blitzkrieg style assault on some other point in the front in order to try to get behind the Russian formations, cut them off from logistical supply, and then just dice them up. It's a risky strategy, but considering the numbers of people and the volume of equipment at Ukrainians' control, that's really the only game that's in town at this point. This is still, always has been, Russia's war to lose. And we're getting close to the point where we're going to see a strategic logjam break one way or another, and it's just about 3 months away.
Protracted conflict that is going to stretch well beyond Ukraine's borders. All right, with that in your back pocket, let's launch in. This is a map of the Russian space, and that green area is the Russian wheat belt. That is the part of Russia that is worth having, where the weather is not so awful, it's still awful, that you can't grow crops. Can't grow much. You get one crop of relatively low quality wheat because the growing season is very short. Summers are very hot and dry and windy, and winters are very cold and dry and windy. If you move to the right, you're in tundra and taigai, that's the blue. If you go to the left, you're in desert. So north to tundra, south to desert. But what really drives the Russians to drink is the beige, territories that even by Russian standards are useless. But they're flat, and they're open, and you can totally run a Mongol horde through those. So what the Russians have always done is reached out past the green, tried to expand, get buffer space, get past that bays, that area that's useless, and reach a series of geographic barriers where you can't run a panzer division through it. And then forward position their relatively slow moving, relatively low tech forces in the access points between. During the Soviet period, the Russians controlled all of those access points. It was the safest that the Russians have ever been. And then they lost it all. And what they've been trying to do under Putin and Yeltsin both has been to re-expand back to those footprints so that they can plug the gaps, plug the places where the invaders would come, get static footprints, lots of troops right on the border where you can't avoid them, you can't outmaneuver them. And this has been what they've been trying to do. This is the Kazakh intervention and the Karabakh War and the Georgian War and the Donbass War and the Crimean War. This is what it's all been about. Ukraine, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, is not one of these access points. It's on the way to the two most important ones in Romania and Poland. So this war was always going to happen, and this was never going to be the end of it. The Russians have launched 8 military expansions since 1992. This is the 9th. And it wasn't going to be the last one. Eventually they would come for Poland and they would come from Romania. But we now know that the Russians are militarily incompetent at fighting a conventional war. So we know if they succeed in Ukraine and they reach the Polish border, they know that there will be a 1,000-to-1 casualty ratio if they face off against NATO forces. So we know that when they do eventually come, if they make it past Ukraine, they will use every tool that they have, and that includes nukes. The Russians feel that they are fighting for their existential existence, and because of their demographic collapse, they are. If they fail to capture Warsaw and northeastern Romania and the Balts, they will shrivel in an open zone, racked by internal disruptions and interfered with from outside powers, and over the next decade or 3, they will cease to exist as a functional country. Winning here is their only option. And since it's death or winning, every possible tool that they have will come into play, and that includes the nuclear question when it becomes their only option. If the Russians win in Ukraine, we will have a nuclear exchange. But if you're Ukrainian, obviously you have a different view on how this should go. What we're looking at here is an old industrial map of industrial assets in the former Soviet system. The box there indicates approximately the Ukrainian borders. And you'll notice that there's a whole cluster of these little industrial circles just beyond the Ukrainian space. Now, we know if the Russians win in Ukraine where they're coming, but think about what it means if the Ukrainians win, if they succeed in ejecting Russian forces from their entire territory. The Russians aren't going to stop. Remember, this is for them an existential fight for their survival. They will continue doing cross-border raids until they feel they have an advantage and they can make another try of it. So the only way that the Ukrainians can win and then live in peace afterwards is to disrupt logistics that prevent industrial plant in those circles from contributing to a war effort on the Ukrainian border zone. And that means the Ukrainians have to cross the border into Russia proper. Whether they do this with planes and missiles, or artillery and rockets, or general army, that will be determined by the facts on the ground when this finally happens. But we're talking about deep strikes in excess of 100 to 200 miles into the Russian space to deliberately destroy industrial plant and especially connecting infrastructure. So we know now that if the Russians win, we're going to have a nuclear crisis. And if the Ukrainians win, it's the beginning of a long slog that will take years to resolve one way or the other until either Ukraine loses the capacity to function or Russia loses the capacity to function. Russia's never backed down from a war without a series of mass casualty events that were so severe that they've lost the ability to maintain a military position at all. They fight until they can't, especially now, considering what is at stake. This is going to get a lot more intense before it gets resolved. And 2022 was honestly just the warm-up and the skirmishes. Fighting in 2023 is going to be a lot more severe because the Ukrainians are finally getting some real heavy equipment and tanks, And the Russians are doing a second mobilization, and they're going to have 750,000 troops in Ukraine.
Recently was one of the world's 5 biggest agricultural exporters for wheat, and it's number 4 in corn, and it's number 1 in sunflower, all important things that help prevent a lot of countries from starving to death. Well, the problem is that most of the stuff that comes out of Ukraine is shipped by water. It's far easier to ship things by water than it is by land, and in terms of rail versus water, about a 3-to-1 cost difference. And Ukraine is perfectly set up for that because they've got the Dnieper River that cuts right south to north through the middle of the country. And so everything just gets on the barge, goes out, eventually hits to the cities of Kherson and Odessa, are put onto big bulkers that then take it through the Black Sea, the Turkish Straits, and the rest of the world. What has happened, however, is with the Russians first capturing Kherson and then putting Odessa under assault, this has all been disrupted. So the only way to move things out of Ukraine at present is by rail. And not only does Ukraine not have a well-developed rail system, it doesn't use the same gauge as the European ports. So it's been very, very difficult to get much of it out. Really less than about 1 out of 6 bushels that they used to ship, they can ship now. Now, the Turks, in league with the United Nations, have convinced the Russians to sign on to a grain deal. And this grain deal allows ships to come into Odessa, get searched by the Russians on the way in to make sure they're not carrying weapons, and then load up with grain and then get searched on the way out to make sure that they're not carrying anything that the Russians don't want to get out. This has increased the volume to about 20 to 25% of the volume that the Ukrainians could do before the war. So still not great. Now, if you've been following the war, you know that throughout the winter, the Russians have been bombing the power grid with drones and missiles to try to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. They've been doing this in the winter, thinking that if you can freeze the country to death, many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people will be injured and killed, and that might weaken the war effort. Once we get to summer, that's going to change. So what the Russians are facing here is that the grain deal is normally renegotiated every 120 days. They're now insisting that they only want a 60-day renewal. Well, if you fast forward from late March, 60 days, we're getting into the beginning of summer. In the beginning of summer, the Russians won't have a vested interest in destroying the power grid because no one's going to freeze to death. So they're going to go after the agricultural system. Everything from fertilizer on the front end to the silos and the rail stations on the back end to try to kill as many people as possible that way. So last year was probably the last year that Ukraine will be a significant agricultural exporter at all, and we should not expect to see the grain deal renewed come late May. That's just the situation we're in. And if you throw in the problems with natural gas and nitrogen processing in Europe hitting the fertilizer market, the problems getting potash out of Belarus hitting the fertilizer market, the problems getting phosphate out of China hitting the fertilizer market, later this year is going to be really rough for a lot of places.
I want to talk now about weather. We've got a number of major agricultural basins in the world, and last year for most of them, Greater Midwest, the Brazilian-Argentine systems, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Eurasian wheat belt, and Northern Europe, we had a pretty good year pretty much everywhere, and even in secondary markets that aren't export-oriented like India and China, things were pretty good. That helped us a great deal despite the fact that we were having a lot of scares and supplies coming out of the former Soviet space. But there's 2 issues that we have already seen are going to be boiling up. The first one involves Argentina. Now, as a southern hemispheric country, they're exiting summer and going into harvest right now. And between floods and droughts and pestilence and basically all the horsemen playing a role here, adding a general dollop of government incompetence, it's shaping up to be one of the worst records for corn, soy, and wheat that we have seen in years, with on average about a 30% reduction in the foodstuffs. Now, 30%, that is a weather-induced reduction, not a fertilizer-induced reduction, so it could have been a lot worse. But we're already seeing at the beginning of the 2023 harvest season that we're getting off to a really bad start. Australia so far looks, and then of course India is harvesting things all the time. Now in the northern hemisphere, we don't get our first crops in for a couple more months, and harvests will continue throughout the late spring for things like winter wheat and going into the summer and into the fall. So we have a lot of potential crops ahead of us, but to kind of kick off with Argentina, which is traditionally in the big 6 for wheat exports and typically in the big 3 for soy exports, this is not a particularly auspicious start. The next major disruption I expect to see will be in Ukraine. Now, we've all been seeing through the winter that the Ukrainians have been suffering missile and drone attacks from the Russians, who are trying to take out the power system, working from the theory that if you can knock out the electricity across Ukraine in the winter, you're going to kill as many Ukrainians as possible and damage the morale of the war effort in general. Because if you find out that your wife and kids back in Kiev don't have power, it's really hard to stay on the front. You feel like you should go and do something. Well, as we get into May and especially June, when it becomes apparent that knocking out the power doesn't make anyone freeze to death anymore, the Russians are going to switch targets to go after the agricultural system, especially fertilizer plants, grain silos, grain transshipment locations at rail centers, ports, and the rest. Already we're seeing the Russians backing away from a United Nations brokered deal that allows grain and corn and wheat and sunflower to get out of the system. Basically, ships can come in, the Russians will search them on the way in to make sure that they're not carrying weapons. The Ukrainians will load them up with whatever foodstuffs they can export, and then they'll be inspected by the Russians again on the way out. It used to be that this deal was being renegotiated every 120 to 150 days, and the Russians want to shrink it down to 60 days, meaning that if this is renegotiated in March, it's probably the last time it's going to be renegotiated, because the Russian goal here is to wipe out as many of Ukrainians as possible to make sure that they can't fight. And that means taking the war to the civilian population. Electricity doesn't work in the summer, so you go after the food supplies, which means that calendar year 2022 was probably the final year that Ukraine will be a significant agricultural exporter. Pre-war, roughly 85, in some cases 90% of their ag products were shipped out by water, with the rest going by rail. The problem is that the rail system in Ukraine doesn't interface well with the rail system in Europe because they use different gauges, and you can only replace that and upgrade it over the course of years, and it's really hard to do when bombs are raining down. So we're going to get little trickles that go out of western Ukraine that can take advantage of the rail. And that's about it. And that's, of course, assuming that the Russians don't achieve a breakthrough once they throw an extra 400,000 men into the fight come June. So we know we've already had a bad Argentine harvest, and we know that the Ukrainians are probably going to fall off the map in terms of
Kyrgyz and everything. All of that's important, but this is the potential game changer that the Ukrainians have been hoping for. The Kerch Bridge is the only large-scale rail connection between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, which is home to about 2.5 million people, most of whom consider themselves to be Russian citizens, and the bulk of Russian forces both in Crimea and in southwestern Ukraine. There are other rail connections in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk, but they do not really connect through to the southwest. The rail connections that are relevant go all the way up to the Dnieper. So in order to get rail from the eastern stretches of Ukraine to the southern, they have to basically go right by Russian positions, and those have been within range of artillery since the beginning of the war. You can guarantee that the Ukrainians are going to be targeting those extra closely now. Logistically, it is difficult to understate the criticality of this for the Russians. Russia doesn't have a road network. The money generated per acre of farmland is so low because it's all short season wheat that they've never built one. They've never been able to afford it. So if you want to move things at volume, you have to move them by rail. And with Kerch being the only real connection, it is the primary way that the Russians supply Crimea and the southwestern front with not just troops and equipment, but with food and fuel. And that's for the civilian population as well. That is now all in question. Now, the Ukrainians have been wanting to hit this bridge since the beginning, but they have not been able to prove to the Americans that they can get trained up or be trusted with the long-range rocket systems that would be necessary to target something that's so reinforced and so distant. So they went old school and used a truck bomb. At the moment, damage assessments are still being done, but it is obvious that one of the two major road spans has been dropped. That is not the sort of thing you fix without several months of work. And they timed the explosion to blow up a fuel train that was going through, so the whole thing's on fire. And simply the repair from that is going to be a minimum of a week, assuming it can be repaired at all. Excuse me. And now that the Ukrainians know it can be done, you can bet they're going to try to hit other parts of it to make sure the thing stays offline. Now, for the first time, we have a path forward for the Ukrainians here to win that is not long and windy. I've always been cautious about saying that Ukraine can win this because by the numbers they can't, especially with the mobilization and the Russians planning on throwing at least 500,000 troops into it. I mean, you throw 500,000 troops into anything, no matter how badly supplied they are, and you can move the boulder and make the situation very different. And that is how Russia has traditionally won all of its wars. But you don't throw 500,000 people at logistics. This is something where either you have the connections or you don't. And if we're talking about Russian troops in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Crimea suddenly being on their own, the Russians can only supply those 3 regions in 2 ways now. One is by truck. And we know that because of all the javelins that have been put into Ukraine and all the RPGs, that the Russians are almost out of their entire military tactical truck fleet, and they've started using city buses and Scooby-Doo vans. And those just can't take the volume of stuff that an active front line needs, and they're certainly far more vulnerable to disruption. The second option is ships. You do have major ports at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, but if we're now in a situation where Kerch can't supply things like anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, food, it's very easy to see the Ukrainians being able to repeat the feat that they did earlier this summer when they sunk the flagship, the Moskva, and do that to every single cargo ship that the Russians try to bring in. Losing cargo ships in that volume, losing trucks and buses in that volume, is hollowing out the entirety of the Russian internal transport system. This is the sort of thing that if you bleed this fast, it takes a decade to recover from. And in a war zone, that is not going to happen, particularly since we're in an environment of sanctions where people are getting more and more skittish about selling the Russians anything.